Okay, so it looks like it's time to start. Just a few quick remarks and then we'll get going. So there are 6 papers, which is a lot, and that means that we'll have to keep each one to about 17 minutes, and then that'll leave a few minutes after the paper for brief discussion. When the papers are being presented, please keep your mic muted. You're welcome to turn on your video, however, if you want, whatever is fine on that. I guess the raise hand is not going to be activated, so if you want to interject something, then just unmute yourself and say it. Hopefully during the presentation there won't be a lot of that just because of the time constraints, but then after presentations, that's the way we'll proceed. When you're done, if you could unshare your screen right away so that the next person up can get in there. And as you probably know, it's going to be a hard stop. So we'll have to be strict with the time enforcement to be fair to the people coming at the end of the program. So I think that's it. Let's get started with the first paper, which is Sebastian Heiss on tariff rate uncertainty and the structure of supply chains. So Sebastian.
Great. Thank you so much for joining this session. This is joint work with Justin Pierce, Georg Schauer, and Peter Short. And the question we're after in this talk is, how does uncertainty about trade policy affect firm supply chains? So we're going to look at this through the lens of the fact that in recent decades, many firms have adopted what we call Japanese-style procurement practices. So Japanese-style procurement for us means just-in-time delivery, low inventories, long-term relationships, and so on. And so the fact that trade policy uncertainty has risen recently might affect the adoption of these practices going forward, and that might affect US trade and ultimately US welfare. So in this talk, I'm going to do 3 things. First, I'm going to lay out a theory of procurement that's based on an extension of some earlier work by Taylor and Wiggins that formalizes this notion of Japanese-style procurement a little bit more. And based on the theory, I'm going to derive some predictions. And in the main part of the talk, I'm going to test these predictions in the data. So in particular, I'm going to do 2 things. First, I'm going to show you evidence of Japanese-style sourcing based on our theory in transaction-level trade data. And second, I'm going to show that lower trade policy uncertainty increases the likelihood of Japanese-style procurement. And then on the last slide, I'm going to illustrate some of the consequences for trade and welfare of a rise in policy uncertainty in an Eaton-Cohen-style framework. So let me begin laying out the theory that we're going to build on. So existing models in trade have so far mostly featured integration as a solution to incomplete contracts and information asymmetries. So here we're going to focus on an alternative to integration, for example, for cases where integration may not be possible due to ownership restrictions, say. So the model we have focuses firms that deal with each other at arm's length, and they have to solve a quality control problem. So the supplier can ship low quality goods and the buyer wants to incentivize the supplier to ship high quality. And so to solve this problem, they're going to choose an optimal order pattern. So building on this paper by Taylor and Wiggins, the buyer is going to choose one of 2 shipping systems to incentivize the seller to deliver high quality. Under the first system, which we call the American system, the buyer simply chooses the lowest cost bidder in the spot market for every transaction. So every transaction could be a different supplier, but then he pays a fixed inspection cost for the arriving shipments to enforce quality. So here the seller knows that his shipments will be inspected, and so he's going to ship high quality goods because otherwise the buyer won't pay him. Sellers have no bargaining power in the model, so they're just being paid marginal cost. Under the second system, the Japanese system, there's not going to be inspection, but instead the buyer is going to promise a long-term relationship to the seller. So here the buyer promises an incentive premium that he's going to pay on top of these marginal costs. And he promises to the supplier that he can keep collecting this incentive premium for as long as the products that he ships ex post turn out to be of high quality. So after the shipment arrives and the buyer pays, eventually you'll find out if the goods were low quality, and if they were, then the relationship won't continue and the supplier won't be able to collect these incentive premia anymore. And that's what keeps the supplier honest. Now, trade policy shocks that arrive at some exogenous rate and breaks these relationships exogenously, and the seller only receives these payments if there's no trade war. If there's a trade war, the relationship ends. And that's what's going to affect the adoption of these Japanese-style relationships. So within each of these procurement systems that the buyer is going to choose endogenously in the model, the buyer is going to choose an optimal order pattern. So we kind of try and illustrate this here. On the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is the inventory. Think of, for example, GM trying to buy 10 cars over the space of 1 year. They're going to choose how many cars to get at each shipment. For example, they can get 2 cars at every shipment, and then when the inventory is at 0, they order again 2 cars, and so on. And that endogenous shipping decision is going to be an important part of the model. So we're going to derive some implications from this model that we can test in the data. The first implication is that the order size under the American system is bigger than the order size under the Japanese system. And this is because of 2 things. First, the American system has this fixed inspection cost, which pushes the buyer towards lumpier shipments to save on inspection costs. And second, the incentive provision motive under the Japanese system means that it's more efficient to order more frequently, to pay this incentive premium more often to the supplier to make sure that no trade war has happened in the meantime. The second implication is that the price under the American system is lower than under the Japanese system because there's this additional incentive premium. And finally, the relationship length, almost by definition, is longer in these Japanese-style procurement practices. The second set of implications are with respect to trade policy. So the cost of Japanese procurement depends on the trade peace probability. And this is because sellers discount their future profit stream, not only based on their rate of time preference, but also based on their policy belief. So if they think that a trade war is very likely, they're going to discount these future incentive premia that they get relatively heavily because they know probably this relationship is not going to last for a very long time period. The cost of American procurement, on the other hand, are independent of trade policy. That is just a spot market transaction. Now, what happens when the probability of trade peace rises? Well, that's going to lower the incentive premium that has to be paid under the Japanese system, because now, with a higher probability of trade peace, in expectation, the relationship is going to last for longer. And that means that the buyer doesn't have to pay as much to the supplier to provide incentives, because the supplier knows the relationship is going to be quite long. And so if initially you were sourcing under the American system, and now the probability of trade peace rises sufficiently, the optimal system may switch from American to Japanese. And if that happens, the order size should fall and the price should rise because of this incentive premium. And we're going to test this in the data. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the theory. Let me now move on towards testing these implications. Let me begin by trying to detect Japanese-style relationships in the data. So the data we use are fairly standard. These are transaction-level US import data from the US Census, covering the entire universe of import transactions. We observe identifiers for the US buyer and the foreign firm, so we can actually see these relationships. We see the dates, the value, quantity shipped, and a detailed product code. And we see the relationship type, whether it's arm's length or related party, and we're going to focus on these arm's length relationships. So to detect the Japanese-style procurement, we want to eliminate any heterogeneity that's associated with, for example, different products. And so we're going to look at this within relatively narrow bins. So we're going to look at importer product country mode of transportation bins. So think as an example, think GM buying car parts from China using the mode of transportation vessel. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the fact that our model says that under the American system, buyers should receive shipments from many sellers, whereas under the Japanese system, they should have a single seller or at least relatively few sellers. So we're going to take this to the data. We're going to look at these narrow bins, and we're going to compute how many sellers the buyer has been using for a given number of transactions over the sample period. So again, take this example of GM. Imagine they had 10 transactions and they used 5 suppliers. We're going to compute this measure suppliers per shipment. SPS is going to be 5 over 10. And so the more suppliers you use relative to the number of transactions, the higher this SPS is. And so for us, this is a more American procurement. So we're going to compute this SPS, and we're going to correlate it with the other attributes of Americanness that our model predicts we should find for such American shipments. So in particular, if you have a high SPS, you should order relatively more per shipment. There should be a lot of weeks between shipments because shipments are bulky. The price should be relatively low and the relationship length should be short. So in regression terms, we run this regression. On the left-hand side is one of these shipment attributes I just described. We regress it on this SPS measure. And crucially, we control for the total quantity sourced over the course of 1 year. So there's not going to be a scale effect driven by the fact that some buyers are large and others are small. So intuitively, we're going to look at GM and Ford. They both buy 10 cars over the course of the year, but GM uses more suppliers than Ford. And we want to know, does this mean that GM gets bulkier shipments, lower prices, and shorter relationships with each? Okay, so we're going to run this regression, and we find pretty much what the model predicted we should find. So again, given the total quantity ordered over the course of 1 year, we find that if you use a lot of suppliers, your shipments are relatively large. Quantity per shipment is high. They're relatively spaced out. There's a lot of gap between shipments. The price is low and the relationship length is short. So that exactly aligns with our theory. Now in the paper, we do a lot more. We show that this classification is correlated with route industries, with countries. For example, shipments from Japan are more likely to be Japanese. I don't really have time, unfortunately, to go into this. I want to go to the second part and look at a change in trade policy uncertainty. So here I want to see whether a change in trade policy uncertainty correlates with the adoption of Japanese-style shipments. And we're going to use a well-known experiment. So in October 2000, the US extended permanent normal trade relations, or PNTR, to China. And this is a change in policy that eliminated the threat of sharp increases in US import tariffs on Chinese goods. So this was pioneered by Pierce and Schott in their 2016 paper. So just very briefly, the US has two basic tariff schedules. One is normal trade relation tariffs, reserved for WTO members mostly, is generally low. And the other are the non-NTR tariffs reserved for non-market economies. These are generally quite high. And importantly, the gap between these two tariff schedules varies significantly across products. So for some products, this gap is small. For other products, this gap is quite large. So what's the policy experiment? So between 1980 and 2000, China was granted these lower NTR tariff rates on a temporary basis. So Congress had to approve every year that tariffs would remain low. And if that failed, tariffs would rise back to these relatively high tariffs. But then in October 2000, Congress granted permanent normal trade relations to China, and this risk was eliminated. So this removed this uncertainty of these renewals. So what we're going to do is we're going to see whether the attributes of US-China shipments within importer-exporter product bins change after this PNTR for shipments from China relative to bins for other countries, and crucially for products that were more affected by the policy change than others, as measured by how much tariffs would have risen before this permanent normal trade relation was implemented if Congress hadn't renewed the policy. So the idea is that if the gap between the two tariff rates is relatively large, if that risk of this large jump is eliminated, that should really push you towards Japanese-style procurement more than if the gap was relatively small. So we should see a stronger adoption of Japanese shipments for products with large gaps. We're going to compare a pre-period and a post-PNTR period by running a triple diff and diff regression. So we're going to have on the left-hand side the usual shipment attributes. On the right-hand side, we have this diff and diff term that I just described for post the PNTR, China, and the size of the gap. We're going to have a lot of interactions that we need to identify this. We're going to control for the total size of the relationship for similar reasons as before, and we're going to have some fixed effects. So here I'm just going to show you the coefficients on this diff and diff term. And what we find is that all the signs are consistent with a switch from the American system to the Japanese system. So we see that given the total size of the relationship, after PNTR, products with a larger gap saw a relative decline in the shipment size and an increase in the shipment price. So this is exactly consistent with the switch towards Japanese-style procurement. And also additionally, the relationships are longer afterwards. So this is exactly consistent. So what do we do? So in the paper, we spent some time then incorporating this into a more quantitative framework. So we take this mechanism, we incorporate it into a standard Eaton-Kortum model of comparative advantage. But in this model, in addition to productivity, there are additional sources of heterogeneity. There's this trade piece probability and inspection costs. And so in this model, the comparative advantage of countries is not only going to depend on productivity, but also on policy uncertainty via this ability of firms to have relationship-based contracts. And so what we can do in this model is we can simulate a decline in trade piece probability with China, kind of simulating what's been happening recently. What we find is that as a result in this model, US imports are going to decline for two reasons. So first of all, now it's more expensive to source under the Japanese system because incentive provision is more expensive. So some some firms are going to switch out of China and buy their products from other countries. In addition to that, for some products now, shipping under the American system from China is going to be the best solution. So they're going to switch from Japanese to American within China. Both of these channels are going to make importing more expensive. So that's going to raise the price level, and so US consumption is going to fall. Okay. So to conclude, we've developed a model that links procurement patterns to trade policy uncertainty. So in a nutshell, as the probability of trade peace declines, import-exporter pairs are less likely to form these Japanese-style relationships. And so if we put this into a quantitative trade model, this policy uncertainty can affect comparative advantage in trade flows. So in particular, changes in policy uncertainty can have negative welfare effects by making this Japanese system more expensive. Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sebastian. We have time for comments, questions. I have a quick question then. So in these customs records, a lot of it is just single shipment matches, and it's often a very small quantity. How do those figure into your calculations? Do you drop those, or do you include those in your shipment count?
Yeah, those will be dropped. So both for the change in trade policy, because we need one transaction before and one transaction after, and for the classification as well, because we need to compute the number of weeks between shipments. So yeah, those are not in there.
Okay, thanks. Well, I guess we might as well move on then. So next up is Kenneth Gillingham presenting stockpiling and avoidance of United States solar panel tariffs.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to speak to you. This is work with Brian Bollinger of NYU and Todd Jordan of Cornell and Drew Ballmer of Duke, who's on the job market, and Daniel Zhu of Duke. So I'm very pleased to be presenting. This is going to be a talk about stockpiling and avoidance. And it's on the broader motivation is that protectionism has come back in vogue in the US. US is currently in the midst of a modest, I'd say, trade war. Maybe someone might dispute that, but one of the aspects of this is that there have been tariffs on solar panels. In 2018, US tariffs were imposed on washing machines, steel, and solar panels. But this actually follows on from a set of tariffs on solar panels that have been placed starting in 2012. And we think solar tariffs are particularly interesting. For one thing, solar panels provide reductions in local air pollution, so there's a social element to this, reduce greenhouse gases. Another aspect to it is very few panels are produced domestically. So there's almost no, or practically no domestic industry currently in the production of the panels. And the tariffs also, the way they were designed allows for substantial avoidance. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. So this study is going to explore tariff avoidance behavior in this important market. We're going to be estimating the responses by solar manufacturers to the tariffs. We're going to be distinguishing between what we're going to call the headline tariff and the strategic tariff. And we're going to show how these have different impacts. There's a broad literature that we're contributing to here. There's a literature on the response to tariffs by multinational firms. And most close to this paper is a recent AER paper by Flan et al. That looks at washing machines and talks about production reallocation of washing machines. But there's a broad literature on this. There's also a growing literature on the incidence of tariffs and who's really being affected by them. Then there's a literature on solar panels and understanding the demand features of solar panels in the market. So in order to understand what we're talking about, it's helpful to have a little bit of background. So there are wafers that go into each solar cell, and the solar cells are put together into modules. The modules are then put together into panels, and then the panels are the system with all the other aspects to them. So there are different levels here in which production can actually be occurring. Now, China has come to very much dominate production of solar panels. In 2006, it was split between a whole bunch of countries, with the US actually having 8%. In 2017, the market's grown very rapidly between then. 2017, China was 71%, and it's even higher today in 2020. There were 4 rounds of US solar tariffs. So in the Obama administration put in tariffs that were anti-dumping tariffs in 2012 and 2014. And these were very focused at the beginning on China solar cells and panels, panels that were assembled in China using Chinese cells. Then the 2014 was anti-dumping that also extended this to Taiwan because they noted that many Chinese companies just simply moved production of the panels. So the cells were still being produced in China and moved the production of the panels to Taiwan. So that was the next element. In 2018, all imports, this is a Section 201, all imports starting at received a tariff starting at 30% and decreasing by 5%. In August 2018, Section 301 were placed, and this was an additional 25% tariff on top of the 30% tariff. So some of the tariffs on some of these Chinese firms actually ended up being quite high. This brings us to the kind of first part, is the rates on some of the firms are quite high. So we're going to call the headline tariff, we're going to define the headline tariff as the rate at which a firm, so suppose a firm produces 75% of their panels in China. They're a multinational firm, they produce 25% somewhere else. The headline tariff is the firm-specific rate if what goes into the US is produced at the same percentage as everywhere else. So as if the shipment to the US, 75% comes from China. This is kind of an extreme because, of course, there's going to be some avoidance, and we're going to emphasize this. So, but the headline tariffs rates on some of the firms are, above 200% on some of the high-rate firms. Now, obviously, the rates vary depending on the tariffs over time, as well as depending on that firm's exposure, the percentage coming from areas that are have tariffs imposed on them. And some of the tariffs on Taiwanese firms are also relatively high. To analyze this question, we bring data together from 2010 to 2020. We look at solar production data from IHS Markit. This is a company that's put together very, very detailed data that follows this market. These are quarterly records of production by firm and country, quarterly records of firm total imports. We have further imports data from Import Genius, which is pretty fun because this was at the shipment level, so we could see sending and receiving firms, the contents. And then we actually have data on household level installations. So we don't observe the utility scale installations, but we're observing household level installations. And that tells us, so when a solar panel is put up on a roof in all of the major markets in the US, we would actually observe it, a residential or commercial rooftop. So let me give some just descriptives so you have a sense about the major changes that have been occurring in this market over time. The real system price has been cut in half since 2010. So it dropped from around $8 to under $4 per watt. The primary way that it was dropping is because the module costs themselves, so the panels themselves were dropping very, very rapidly. And this is coming from drops in the wafers, drops in the cells, and drops in the modules. There have been drops in all of these. So very, very substantial declines, going from above $5 to around $1 per watt. Another important and interesting aspect to this is that if you look at the factory gate average prices of the top 20 firms out there, most of them bunch right around in the same area. There's not a lot of price dispersion in factory gate average prices, with the exception of a few companies, and that's for some subtle quality differences. So there are a few companies that have subtly different quality, but largely the market is all around in the same place, and actually it converged some during this time. So that's another actually interesting aspect to this market, that there may be some unobserved quality, but there's not much price dispersion. And just to get a sense of, at least on the residential and commercial side, this gives you a sense about kind of the overall installed capacity, new capacity coming in over time is what this is telling you. Huge jump here because the investment tax credit dropped down just before that point. So what was going on with manufacturing? So in 2010, Q1, if you look at the world, there was very little module production outside of China by major Chinese firms. As you go to after the 2012 tariffs, firms continued to focus manufacturing in China, with a little bit coming in Turkey and Canada, After the 2014 tariffs, we start to see more production arising elsewhere. And as we move forward into the 2018 tariffs, we even see some firms beginning module manufacturing in US. In fact, so there's a plant in Tempe or right outside of Phoenix, and larger plants in Indonesia and in South Korea and basically in Southeast Asia. So there was definitely a movement going on. Most of this is actually at the cell or module level. So not much of it is at the wafer level. This plots firms with Chinese production and firms with not with Chinese production. We saw kind of flat and then a major increase for firms with Chinese production on the cell production outside of China, started increasing at a faster rate. When we look at cell production outside of China and Taiwan, we see it even stronger of an increase. So there's definitely a difference, whereas the cell production inside, for firms with no Chinese and Taiwanese production, it's kind of a steady slope along this time. So there clearly was some production reallocation going on. Some of you may be curious, so I had to throw in this slide. Has US production increased? No, not for cell and wafers. For some of the modules at the very end, there was a little bit of production increase, and that was what we saw in the map. So now I'm going to present some descriptive regressions to give you a sense about whether this headline tariff appears to be passed through. And this is regressing the system price. This is overall end system price on headline tariff and quarter. And we don't see much of anything at all here. If we look at module prices, so this is the price of the module itself. So system price included everything else, markup, the inverter and everything else. But now this is focusing just on the modules themselves. We see, again, very, very little impact, which would suggest very little pass-through possibly, or maybe these headline tariffs are not a very good metric because of avoidance. There's also some clear evidence of stockpiling going on. So we looked, and it was especially true with the 2018 tariffs. So we saw, this is US sales by firm quarter, and we saw kind of continual increases, a little jump here right before the 2014 one came into effect. And then before the 2018, we saw a real spike here. And it had been increasing, and there was a bit of a decline, but then a real spike just before. So with this behind us, we want to really be thinking about how this avoidance is taking effect and what firms might be doing when being faced with these tariffs. So given that these are all firms that export to many different countries, and they are located in multiple countries, they're multinational firms, there are ways to besides stockpiling, there's also production reallocation that could be going on. So we're going to construct strategic tariffs rates. So these are assuming the manufacturer is going to actually source the imports to minimize the tariffs, to reallocate production. So basically, take the production that's in the US from that one plant or two plants in the US, right, and have it all go to the US. Take the production that's in Canada, have it go to the US because the tariffs are higher coming from China. They'll still be producing in China. They'll just send those to other countries that don't have tariffs. And so we construct this strategic tariff rate by solving this. So basically, it's just what I described. This strategic tariff rate turns out to be much lower than the headline tariff rate. The headline tariff rate was this, assuming that each shipment into the US has the same percentage coming from the average percentages over the all of the countries that the firm produces in. But the strategic tariff is focusing just on them allowing to reallocate production. And so here we have a much lower tariff rate. What we did is we actually FOIA'd, used the Freedom of Information Act, what the actual duties were paid. And it turns out that our imputed strategic tariff, what the duties come out to be, is very close to what we FOIA'd for the duties. So it looks like most firms are doing something very close to the strategic tariff, which makes a lot of sense. And that means they're facing a much lower tariff. So I'm going to present some reduced form regression results to give you a sense of the effects on prices and quantities. We're looking at the firm-specific outcome. We're looking at 1 plus the tariff measure, and we can do this for a headline or a strategic tariff, and we're going to be including firm fixed effects and time fixed effects. So these are descriptive results, but they give you a sense. So if we look at the effect on prices, the strategic tariff, very little effect. Small effect, it's significant, but it's a very small effect of the headline tariff. These can be interpreted as elasticities. But on quantities, we actually see, especially if we use a strategic tariff, a much, much larger effect. So strategic tariff is really actually influencing quantities is what we see, whereas a headline tariff, you don't see it as much. And again, we're arguing that the strategic tariff is matching more closely the actual effective tariff that's going to be hitting these firms. So this is also can be seen over time. When we look at the drop, this is the percentage change in share, and we see some pretty large drops during some of this time. This leads us to motivate our modeling approach. So we have this setting. We have a relatively small number of larger manufacturers. We have little response in prices and a clear response in quantities. And we also have limited factor gate price dispersion, which suggests that these are, for the most part, a commodity, with the exception of a few firms that might have some unobserved quality, at least unobserved to us quality. And this would suggest a Cournot model with unobserved firm quality. So that's actually what we estimate. We model firms in Cournot-Nash equilibrium. In each period, they're going to be solving. So they're going to be getting at their profits, wholesale price minus costs, and times the quantity, fixed costs. And then they have some forward-looking activity where they're looking at the fact that tariffs are going to be adjusting. We saw the stockpiling. We saw some avoidance in our descriptive results. So they're allowed to be forward-looking for a period in advance, the year in advance. So assuming that firms know this next period tariff increase and expect no changes thereafter, given that this is a 17-minute talk, I'm not going to go into all the first order conditions in the theory, but this gives us our forward-looking estimation equation and our estimation equation that doesn't allow for this forward-looking dynamics, these forward-looking dynamics. And so we estimate this model via nonlinear least squares. So directly out of the model, we see using the static model, the dynamic model are actually not that different. This alpha parameter that's here in the model, I'm not going to go through all the model, but this is a market level price elasticity demand. So the equilibrium market level price elasticity with respect to market level demand. And so that's about 2.24. So it's pretty large elasticity actually. But this allows us to run counterfactuals. So to run counterfactuals, one of the counterfactuals we've run several, but one of them that we've run is we say, what if we switch from this strategic to the headline tariff? For the tariff exposed firms, what would be the percentage change in quantity on average across all of those firms? And it's actually quite large. So without this avoidance behavior, this production reallocation, our counterfactual would indicate that you'd have very, very substantial percentage changes in quantities, which is, we thought, quite interesting and really emphasizes the importance of avoidance. So I think I'm actually on time. My conclusions are, well, we find clear evidence of this tariff avoidance from strategic relocation and stockpiling. We are motivated to construct something closer to the actual effective tariff rate. We're calling these strategic tariff rates, allowing the firms to reallocate their production. And this measure shows an effect of the tariffs, where there's a larger effect on market shares and a minimal effect on equilibrium prices, which is actually interesting from a pass-through perspective. And using this measure, we quantify the avoidance. One of the counterfactuals that I'm showing shows very large declines in Chinese firm sales without avoidance, without that avoidance that is occurring. And so we find that this is very useful for thinking about the actual effects you end up getting when you put in place tariffs on firms that are multinational firms. And so with that, I think I have some time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kenneth. We do have time for questions. Just unmute yourself if you want to jump in.
Can I ask a quick question? So do you think there's a role of the rule of origin requirements for the solar panels? I mean, the US, for example, if the Chinese firm set up a plant in Mexico, the rule of origin would be different if the Chinese firm sets up a plant in other countries.
So are you asking, is there a role for tariffs that cover regions? Is that what you're asking?
The rule of origin, like, the rule of origin requirement for solar panel. I don't know the details, but I'm wondering whether, yeah.
Perhaps, I don't know. Maybe some of my co-authors have thoughts on this. I'd be curious if Daniel has thoughts on that. Perhaps there's a role.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the difference between the 2012 and 2014, and that's what we documented. That when you look at the 2012, the effective tariff is almost zero, because the U.S. didn't really realize that the Chinese firms being all packaging whatever produced in China and called them Taiwanese products, and then since it's so easy to ship everything through Taiwan under the name of Taiwan, and once they fix that loophole, you do see the effective kind of strategic tariff start to go up a little bit in 2014. Yet, that since it doesn't really cover a broad range of countries, you still see that's by far not as effective as the 2018 one. So it does get tightened over time, and does have a lot to do with the ability of the U.S. Government to identify where exactly the solar panel is being manufactured as well as being assembled.
Okay.
Yeah, one way to think about it is that I think the origin requirements actually are part of the reason why we see all this production reallocation. And so it's playing a major role. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I was wondering, in this tariff minimization problem you outlined, it seemed to me that they're only minimizing with respect to the US, but shouldn't they be minimizing with respect to every country? So if you are serving the US through Canada, now you don't have any more capacity to produce in Canada, so now you can't ship to Canada, you have to serve Canada from China. And so can you elaborate on this a little bit? I found this very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and we could put more thought into that for sure. There were, during this time period, Europe had some tariffs during this time period. So there were other tariffs, but the highest, to the best of my knowledge, the highest tariffs were the US ones. So the greatest motivation would be to avoid the US ones, which was sort of the motivation behind our definition. But to the extent that there are other tariffs, there could be additional reallocation going on, and thus that hits constraints. We do account for the capacity constraints, though, in the sense that, like, we're not allowing a country that didn't produce a certain amount to be producing that amount in calculating the strategic tariff, right? The strategic tariff is calculated based on the amount that was actually being produced in those countries. So I think the capacity constraints are actually playing a real role here that you bring up. So like the Canadian plants for a couple companies do definitely have capacity constraints, and so they might be going at max, and then they'd have to build a new plant, and that's where the fixed costs come in. So I think it's a really important point.
Okay, well, we're right on time. So in fact, a little bit ahead of time. So Paul, do you want to share your slide? You need to unmute yourself, Paul.
Oh, gosh, thank you very much. Let me go back one. So it's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Giancarlo Corsetti. This paper is a little bit different from the other papers in this session in that we're studying the macroeconomic effects of tariffs. And in particular, we're studying the monetary dimension. Central to our model is the idea that nominal rigidity, sticky prices, can affect the implications of tariffs for international relative prices. And even more importantly, these nominal rigidities give monetary policy power over the real exchange rate, which also can influence those international relative prices. So this work is aiming to answer questions that central banks have been asking looking for guidance on the appropriate monetary policy response to events like Brexit and the Trump tariff wars. So there is a macroeconomic literature on this question, but most of it abstracts away from the monetary dimension and doesn't talk about monetary policy that we're focusing on. And those papers that do look at monetary policy tend to not look at the optimal policy, but instead have in the background a standard Taylor policy rule, which tends to put strong weight on stabilizing inflation. When we're looking at optimal monetary policy, we're taking fiscal policy to be an exogenous shock, not looking at the optimal tariff policy. Our thinking is that the recent events of the Trump tariff war and Brexit, given their political origins, are best thought of as exogenous shocks rather than as optimal tariff policy. So we think our approach is appropriate to what's going on. Our approach is to use a standard macroeconomic tool that is a theoretical monetary dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that we calibrate to represent aspects of the real world. We augment this standard macro model with certain features that we borrow from trade literature that have been used to study tariffs. Just to preview results in case they do run short on time, we find that a monetary expansion to induce an exchange rate depreciation can be useful to blunt the effects of a tariff shock, but it will only do so part way. It's not actually optimal to use exchange rates to fully offset the effects of tariffs on relative prices because there are other macroeconomic implications of the monetary policy that's being used to create the exchange rate depreciation. So you have to think about other side effects. And even in the case of a symmetric trade war, where one might think that there's no role for the exchange rate itself to influence relative prices because the tariffs are canceling out their effects on those cross-border relative prices, there's still a role for monetary expansion coordinated between the two countries in order to blunt the fall in global output that otherwise would result from that global trade war. And in this latter case, we find that the Ramsey optimal policy is actually the opposite of what the standard Taylor policy that's been assumed in the related literature. It's opposite of what that would prescribe. So you shouldn't follow the standard rule. The optimal is actually distinct from that. Okay, so let me just give you a briefest outline of the key elements of our theoretical model. As in most multi-country or two-country general equilibrium macro models, there are a lot of equations and things going on. So I'm going to abstain from giving the equations and just highlight the key elements. Some are from the macro literature, some are from the trade literature. Something borrowed from the trade literature is the use of multiple traded sectors. And in this case, we'll have two tradable sectors. One is in differentiated goods that we think of as manufacturing. This sector is characterized by monopolistic competition, firm entry with a sunk entry cost, iceberg trade costs, and this is the sector that will exhibit sticky prices, modeled as a Rothenberg adjustment cost to changing prices. The macro literature tends to associate sticky prices with monopolistic competition because these are the firms that have the power to set prices. So this is the sector where that sticky price assumption will have bite. The other sector is a non-differentiated sector, assumed to be perfectly competitive with flexible prices and frictionless trade. So not much is going on there, but it's important to have the sector, we think, in order to be able to consider implications of tariff policy for intersectoral relative prices and effects on comparative advantage. So we're going to have ad valorem tariffs in this, otherwise in this macro style model, which can affect either sector, but in the results I'm showing to you, I'm going to focus on tariffs on that differentiated sector. Okay, a couple other key elements in the model. Production requires both labor and intermediates. Labor supply is endogenous. Now that's, I think, not typical of trade. It is typical of macro, and this does imply that leisure will affect utility and will have a role in determining optimal monetary policy. We also have trade in assets, which permit non-zero trade balances, which is important in the macro context. And the shocks to tariffs will be modeled as autoregressive shocks calibrated to the Trump trade war. We're going to solve for a second order approximation around a deterministic steady state that allows us to consider the effect of risk premia on the decisions that economic agents make. And we're also going to compute the conditional welfare, including the transition, which can affect what the optimal policy is, not just the steady state. And for monetary policy, we're going to study a couple of standard rules, including that Taylor rule, alongside the Ramsey optimal cooperative, in this case, policy. I'm going to skip over the equations and tell you about the experiments that I'll be running. So there are two different types of scenarios we're going to consider. One in which there's a unilateral tariff shock imposed by the foreign country on the home, or on one country on the other, but the impulse responses I show you will be a foreign shock on the home exports. And we're also going to consider a symmetric tariff in which both countries are imposing tariffs on each other of equal amount at the same time. We think of that as a full retaliation tariff. The results I'll be reporting to you are of three types. We're going to look at dynamic response in the form of an impulse response to a single isolated shock to get a sense of what's going on. We're also going to take a look at the unconditional means of variables in the second order approximation. So that's going to show the effect of uncertainty about tariff shocks on variables. And then lastly, I'll report to you the conditional welfare in a stochastic setting of alternative policy rules, given these shocks are going on all the time. I'm going to report three alternative monetary policy responses. One we call a no policy case. That's where there's a constant money growth that's not responding to the tariff shock at all. Second will be a standard Taylor rule, which puts a big weight on stabilizing aggregate inflation. And third will be what we compute to be the Ramsey optimal cooperative policy to maximize the average across two countries of the discounted stream of utility of the agents. Okay, so the first scenario to look at is the unilateral tariff shock. Now, most of the results that I'm going to show to you are going to be different versions of this graph. So I'm trying to report the dynamic responses to a single foreign tariff shock on home exports for a number of key variables. First, I'll start by talking about the flexible price case, which is the solid black line. And I just want to highlight a few key implications. This foreign tariff shock on home exports will lower home GDP and lower the home trade balance, not surprising. It will also shift the comparative advantage of the home country away from the differentiated goods sector toward the non-differentiated goods sector on which the tariff is not hitting. And there's limited implications for the exchange rate. So the macro literature has developed a long list of macro features that would limit the equilibrium exchange rate response on its own to these tariff shocks. And in this particular calibration, there's not much going on with the exchange rate in and of itself unless monetary policy makes something happen. So before I show the monetary policy effects, I just want to document that sticky prices do matter here. So that's now we're looking at the dashed blue lines. And what you'll notice is that the effect of the tariff on outputs and relative prices are larger. So for example, the fall in home differentiated goods production is now about 50% bigger than it was under the flexible price case. So why do sticky prices make the effects of tariffs bigger? Well, at least in our model, it means that firms don't have the ability to change their prices to strategically offset the effects of the tariff. They simply are not allowed to do it in the short run, or to reflect the fact that the recession being caused by the tariff lowers wages, but they can't pass those cost savings on to consumers to help offset the tariff effects either. So sticky prices make the effect of tariffs worse. Okay, now I'd like to take a look at the effect of a standard Taylor rule, which focuses mainly on keeping inflation dynamics near zero with a small weight on output stabilization. So that's the green line now that's showing up on this figure. And what you'll notice is that the green line typically is between the black and the blue lines here, which really just means that the Taylor rule is moving the equilibrium closer to the flexible price equilibrium. It's helping to erase the amplification from the sticky prices. And that's a typical result in macro in which the Taylor rule tries to eliminate the effects of the sticky price distortion. Okay, so now we're ready to take a look at what we compute to be the optimal monetary policy, maximizing the stream of welfare of the countries. And that's now appearing as a red line. Okay, so what do we see here? This policy is using a monetary expansion in order to cut interest rates and make the domestic currency depreciate. Now, given that the exchange rate is defined as home currency units per foreign, when the exchange rate goes up, it means the domestic currency is falling in value. So this is a domestic currency depreciation. And you'll notice that the red line then, it helps offset the effects on the terms of trade because of the tariff. And it also significantly moderates the effects on GDP overall and production of home differentiated goods. But it doesn't fully offset what's going on here. In principle, it could with a larger depreciation, but that would involve a larger fall in the interest rate, which would have other effects on the macroeconomy, such as stimulating consumption, which is not efficient. Okay. So there's a role for monetary policy here to do things. We also compute what the effect is of how monetary policy can help offset the effects of tariff uncertainty. To do this, we need to solve for the second order approximation of the model and compute the unconditional means of variables. So the way we're reporting this is the percent difference of the means of variables in a suboptimal case, in this case, the Taylor policy. How different is the Taylor policy case from the optimal Ramsey case? And what you'll notice is that in the benchmark calibration, consumption is lower for the suboptimal Taylor rule than under the optimal case, but employment and output are higher. But that actually means that leisure has gone down. So you're working harder and consuming less. That is a fall in welfare. And in terms of the welfare falls by 0.155%. That's a fairly small number, but that's typical in macroeconomic circumstances. It's a little bit larger than what we get in our model when we consider the effect of typical productivity or TFP shocks. You see similar or even smaller welfare effects than you see here for the tariff shocks. And the benefit of optimal monetary policies is even bigger than in the case of productivity shocks. The effects are a little bit bigger if you allow for greater substitutability between these two sectors. And that's something that macro models tend not to consider. There's a greater distortion of the optimal allocation of production, a greater distortion to comparative advantage when these two sectors are more substitutable, and the tariffs distort that more. Okay. I'd like to briefly talk about the other scenario. So before we're looking at a one-sided shock where the foreign country imposes a tariff on the home country. Now let's take a look at a symmetric tariff where both countries are imposing tariffs on each other of equal amounts. It's a perfectly symmetric case. So in this case, the foreign variables are by definition the same as for the home variables. And you see there's a fall in global GDP and in the global production of differentiated goods. So there's a distortion on the production between the two sectors worldwide. It also leads to a rise in inflation. This is why the macro literature studying this question has tended to associate tariffs as a supply shock. It leads to a fall in output and a rise in aggregate prices, inflation. And that's why the green line here, the Taylor rule, implies a rise in interest rates. That implies a monetary contraction in order to fight a tariff war that's creating a recession. So you see a rise in interest rates here. With the optimal policy will do the opposite. It again calls for a monetary expansion, a cut in interest rates. Now, there's not much role for exchange rates here because both countries are working together to raise money supplies in their respective countries. So the exchange rate isn't doing much here, but still the monetary expansion creates an increase in global demand, which helps moderate the fall in global production. I just want to highlight that this is the opposite. The optimal policy implies the opposite policy response to the typical Taylor rule. We also compute the welfare effects in this symmetric case. They're a bit smaller than for the one-sided shock. A few additional results. We also take a look at other types of price stickiness in terms of the local currency rather than the producer currency. We find that this assumption does not affect the implications of tariffs on their own, but but it does affect the usefulness of monetary policy because exchange rates no longer affect the relative prices that consumers see. So it's no longer, so in this case, the policy looks more like a Taylor policy. And finally, we also have for a macro audience, a single sector version of our model that looks more like a typical macro model, in which there's only the differentiated goods sector. But we find that the results are actually quite similar to the results I just presented to you for the full two-sector model. It's optimal for policymakers to use a monetary expansion in order to cut interest rates, and in the one-sided shock case to depreciate their currency in order to help combat a tariff shock. And that's because even if you don't have intersectoral reallocation at work, you still have a trade balance that is not balanced, and the tariff has implications for that are inefficient. So just to reiterate the conclusions here, we argue there's a role for monetary policy to help ease the cost of tariff shocks, which I think is information that central banks would find useful. We argue in favor of a monetary expansion, which is contrary to a typical Taylor rule that we often think central banks would rely on in order to induce exchange rate depreciations in order to help blunt the effects of a tariff shock. But even in the case where exchange rates are not useful, in the case of a tariff war, it's still useful to employ a coordinated monetary expansion in order to help blunt the effect of the global fall in output. And then this policy is the opposite of what we typically think of in terms of a Taylor rule, which is why we think it's useful to do analysis of this type to actually look a little bit under the hood in order to see what the effects of tariff shocks are in a sticky price world and what the optimal policy is in that case. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Again, we have time for questions and comments.
So maybe I'll just end with a plug that it's worthwhile for trade economists to think about some of these macroeconomic implications as well. And there are lots of things for macro to learn from trade and vice versa.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul. Next up is Jeremy Choi, presenting Anxiety or Pain, the Impact of Tariffs and Uncertainty on Chinese Firms in the Trade War.
Okay, thanks for having me. My name is Jeremy Choi from University of Hawaii. This is my recent working paper titled Anxiety or Pain, the Impact of Tariffs and Uncertainty on Chinese Firms in the Trade War. Joint work with Philippa Bengria at University of Kentucky and Deborah Swenson at UC Davis and Ming-Chu Shi at Peking University. So the topic that I'm going to talk about today is this one, the US-China trade war. So I believe this is the biggest event to trade commerce right before the COVID-19 during 2018 and 2019. So under trade administration, newly implemented US trade policies stand in stark contrast with a long trend towards freer trade. So in the first quarter of 2018, the US tariffs were not specifically targeting some countries, such as like safeguard tariffs on solar panels and washing machines and steel and aluminum under national security grounds. So that's the first quarter of 2018. And in the second quarter, so I'm going to denote this first round, in the second quarter, the US tariffs are targeting on specific countries, China, so Chinese products. So in July and August 2018, like 50 billion US tariff with 25% rate. And in return, China also imposed like 50 billion tariff list with 25% rate. And then in September, 200 billion US tariffs with 10% rate and 60 billion Chinese tariff list ranging from 5 to 10% went into effect. And 2019, there's a little bit more tariffied. So this graph shows the US tariffs on Chinese goods. So this is just unweighted average across HS 8-digit product codes. So here, green is most favored nation tariffs. So quite stable, like a little bit lower than 5%. And from 2018 quarter one, there's a huge jump. This blue is summation of most favored nation tariff and trade war tariff. And as you can see, 2018 Q1, a little bit less than 5%, and 2019 Q4, closer to 25%. Similarly, this is Chinese tariff rates on US products. So from this green again is the most favored nation tariff, and blue is the summation of most favored nation tariff plus the trade war tariff. So about 10% and then 25%. So what we're gonna do in this paper is asking this question: what are the impacts of the 2018 and 2019 trade war on Chinese firms? So when we go back to the literature, there's a study that mostly focused on the US economy. Now there are more papers, but when we studied this project, they were mostly focused on the US economy, such as like Fagenbaum and others, QJ paper, Amit and others paper. So in this paper, we provide evidence of the trade war on Chinese firms. And previous literature mostly focused on the textbook price adjustment channel, where higher tariffs induce higher prices faced by consumers and firms. There's a terms of trade effect that induces reallocation, that may also generate general equilibrium effect across industries and regions. In this paper out, we turn our attention to the trade policy uncertainty. In addition to the standard price adjustment mechanism, uncertainties perceived by Chinese firms or US firms may also increase during the trade war. So IMF 2018 noted that the trade war has significantly raised the uncertainty. And there's some previous papers like Handley 2014 and Handley Mang 2015 and 2017 and Fong, Lee, and Swenson 2017. They also studied trade policy uncertainty, and trade policy uncertainty can affect firm level entry and investment, have important implication for welfare. And those studies were mostly focused on the entry of China in 2001. So in this paper, we investigate this new trade policy uncertainty channel, which has been rarely studied at the firm level, and provide new insights on this research area. So what's new in this paper? So we use unique and comprehensive data set from three sources. First, we have firm level customs data, transaction level data, Chinese firms and exporting and product, and Chinese firms and importing the country and product, and combined with trade war tariffs and most favored nation tariffs, so we can measure firm level measure of tariff exposure. And then we conduct textual analysis to retrieve firm specific, firm year varying trade policy uncertainty using annual reports. And third, we also use firm level real outcome variables from CompuStat Global Database. So we combine these three data sources and exploiting the US-China trade war and study the sources and consequences of trade policy uncertainty during the trade war. So here we specifically denote endogenous TPU because in this literature, to the best of our knowledge, when people think about trade policy uncertainty, they treat it as a right-hand side variable and think about how this trade policy uncertainty shock affects like firm level outcome variables such as investment. That's a typical way of thinking about this trade policy uncertainty. So we're going to also do that, but we try to unpack then what are the sources of trade policy uncertainty. What changes this trade policy uncertainty at the firm level? And then we exploit this US-China trade war as a shock and then treat this trade policy uncertainty on the left-hand side variable, which is the endogenous variable, to think about the sources of trade policy uncertainty during the trade war. So using this detailed data set combined with identification strategy allows us to shed some light on mechanisms by which the trade war impacts Chinese firms. So our strategy is we are going to use a standard DID technique that based on variation across Chinese firms in exposure to trade war tariffs. So there are two ways that this trade war can affect Chinese firms. So first is US tariffs. What if the Chinese firms are exporting to US, it is hit by the US tariff. And what if the Chinese firms are sourcing from the US, Chinese firm is hit by the retaliation tariff. So we're going to use these two variations to think about how trade war affects trade policy uncertainty. What we found in this paper is that increases in US tariff and Chinese retaliation tariffs both raise trade policy uncertainty for Chinese firms. And the impact was heterogeneous. Impact of tariffs on uncertainty was heterogeneous. And then, so number one and number two is to think about the endogenous trade policy uncertainty, how the tariff changes affect trade policy uncertainty. And then number three is what if trade policy uncertainty was heightened? How does that affect the firm level of variables? So we found that an increase in trade policy uncertainty leads to a reduction in investment, R&D expenditure, and profit. So firm level measurement. So how we measure the firm level tariff exposure is as follows. As I mentioned, there are two ways. First is the US tariff, and the second is the Chinese tariffs. So here, tau JT is the US tariff imposed on Chinese products, the product J and time T. So we can observe tariff at the product level, and then we convert this product level tariff to firm I and time T, the firm level tariff measure. And then we use this standard shift share technique. So here is the share of firm I's export of good J to US divided by firm I's total exports to US. So in this way, we can measure firm specific, the firm and time varying tariff exposure to the US tariffs. So this is the average. So we averaged out across all firms in our data set. And as you can see, this point is average firm level tariff, and this bar is 95% confidence interval. And then so this is the timing of when the trade war started. And as you can see, not only average has increased, but also you can see the variance has increased. So there's a huge variation across Chinese firms in response to the US tariff increase. Similarly, we can also measure Chinese tariff exposure of a Chinese firm I in time T. So in the similar logic, we have this product level Chinese tariff, retaliation tariff, imposed on import from the US. And then we have this share, the import share, and then convert this product level tariff to firm level firm specific tariff exposure. So again, we plot the average and 95% confidence interval. But similarly, like before, like the US tariff, beginning in 2018 Q1, the average has increased and also the variance has increased. And then we're going to use this variation across firms. And next, we also construct firm level trade policy uncertainty. So here we're going to use firms' annual reports, and those firms are listed on the Chinese like Shanghai and Shenzhen stock market. So our annual firm level TPU measures are constructed using a textual analysis of the transcript of yearly reports of publicly listed companies in China. So we have, let's say, from Chinese firm I in time T, in year T, and we save it as a PDF file, and then for firm I and time T, each line of transcript is saved as an observation. And then we search each line for the keywords related to uncertainty. So there are two parts. Trade policy is one part, and uncertainty is the other part. And we search each line for the keywords related to uncertainty. And also, separately, we search each line for trade policy-related keyword, such as tariff, import duty, export tariff, and the others. And then, what if both uncertainty keywords and trade policy keywords are in the same line or above or below one line? Then we count them as trade policy uncertainty measure. For instance, so this is the annual report. Here we have risk in sales. This is uncertainty related keywords. And once again, we have uncertainty related keywords here. But in this blue one, we don't have trade policy related keyword. So this is not trade policy uncertainty. Here we have in the same line, we have protectionism, unilateralism. That is trade policy related keywords and also uncertainty. So this red is trade policy uncertainty. In this way, we can count the number of trade policy uncertainty measure at the firm and the year. So more formally, the firm level TPU for firm I in year T is defined as follows. So first, this is a dummy variable if the uncertainty related keywords are in here. And at the same time, the trade policy related keywords are here. That is counted as 1. And then we're summing over all the report and divided by the length of report measured as a total number of Chinese characters. So that's how we define trade policy uncertainty for firm I in year T. So this is a summary table. So the first is the appearance in the range of plus or minus 1 line. And the second criterion is a appearance in the same line, trade policy and uncertainty. And then keywords number, as you can see, we are specifically focusing on the US-China trade war 2017 and 2018. As you can see, mean has quite stable and there's a jump. Not only average, but also standard deviation is quite stable and there's a jump. So I think the columns show the similar pattern. Okay, thank you, James, for the 5 minutes here. And to check external validity, we averaged out the older firms at the year level. So the red is our TPU based on our annual report of listed firms. And then we overlap our measure with Davis and other co-authors like aggregate trade policy uncertainty in China. That's blue. And as you can see, these 2 lines are quite alike. Okay, so now we have these 2 measures, so firm-specific tariff measure and trade policy uncertainty measure, to think about how the 2018-2019 trade war affects trade policy uncertainty by specifying the following definitive type specification. So the dependent variable is a change in trade policy uncertainty. And here the US tariff, change in the US tariff and Chinese tariff. And the period is two points, the 2017 Q4 before the trade war and 2018 Q4 after the trade war. And after controlling for the initial time controls and region and industry fixed effect. And the results are as follows. So we relate, we start by relating the US tariff and trade policy uncertainty. We find positive and statistically significant. And also for the Chinese tariff, and we combine this one, and then we add more control variables such as region fixed effect, industry fixed effect, and then firm characteristics. What we found here is that the US tariff impact on trade policy uncertainty is positive, but not statistically significant, while Chinese tariff has significant, positive, and statistically significant. That's our first finding. And then we also explore some heterogeneous effect. So by interacting like the low revenue with the US tariff and low revenue with the Chinese tariff or like capital intensity. So what we found is we found a negative interaction effect. That means the bigger firms perceive less uncertainty in response to the impact of US tariff on trade policy uncertainty. So the why we found like smaller firms are perceive bigger impact, because we think that Fan and Lee and Ipo JDI paper, they find that around the time of Chinese WTO session, lower productivity firms benefit more from the session to the quality upgrading that is facilitated by trade liberalization. So what if Chinese firms are sourcing optimally? Then this event is a reversal of this opportunity. So the damage, so that's why the damage will be greatest for these firms, which are likely to be characterized by low capital intensity, small revenue, and low productivity. And then we also check trade diversification effect. So we can count the number of exporting countries at the firm level and number of products at the firm level, exporting products or importing products. And what we find is this one. So especially in the impact of US tariff on the Chinese firm trade policy uncertainty is mitigated if the firms are exporting multiple countries. So that implies the multi-country exporters perceive less uncertainty after an increase in tariff, presumably due to their ability to reroute trade. And also, that was our first part, how this the US tariff and Chinese tariff increased trade policy uncertainty. And then what if trade policy uncertainty has increased? How does that affect firm level outcome variables, such as like investment, the R&D expenditure and profits, by specifying the following regression. So here, the trade policy uncertainty is on the right-hand side variable, and in the left-hand side variable, we use firm level outcome variables. And we find the heightened trade policy uncertainty negatively affect investment, negatively affect spending on R&D expenditure, and negatively affecting the profits. Okay, to summarize, in this paper, what we do is we explore the sources and consequences of trade policy uncertainty during the ongoing US-China trade war. The source part is how this US tariff shock and Chinese tariff shock affect the trade policy uncertainty. And the consequent part is how heightened trade policy uncertainty affects like fund level investment, R&D expenditure, and profits. So the main takeaway message from our paper is that while it has been generally acknowledged that trade policy uncertainty must have played a role in the trade war, there's a little understanding of how the process works, the magnitude of this channel, and which firms are more exposed to it. So we believe that we move one step in this direction by showing that increases in fund level trade policy uncertainty seen during this period are systematically associated with exposure to both US tariffs and Chinese tariffs. And the second message, takeaway message, is that we document the negative consequences of the trade policy uncertainty spike on fund investment, R&D expenditure, and profits. So we think overall our work highlights the importance of the trade policy uncertainty channel during the ongoing US-China trade war. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, thanks, Jerem. Comments, questions?
I have a question. So I was wondering, in the last regression, where you look at these outcomes and you regress them on trade policy uncertainty, are you controlling also for the level of tariffs? I mean, it seems from the first set of regressions that the two are quite related, so the uncertainty and the level of tariffs. So I guess I'd extend this question, how do you know it's not the level that is driving the decline in investment and so on? How do you know it's uncertainty?
I think the left-hand side variable is the difference. And then we also control for, like, as you mentioned, like initial time level variables.
The measure of exposure to Chinese tariffs, that was all intermediate inputs, or did you deal with outputs as well?
Oh, everything, the intermediate inputs. And mostly these firms are mostly the manufacturing firm, the listed firms. So those are, I believe, the intermediate inputs mostly.
Okay, so they don't sell much in the domestic market?
Excuse me?
Well, I was just saying they probably don't sell much to the domestic market, in which case competition there is not as important.
Yes.
Jared, can I ask a question?
Sure.
It seems that you're using only the each firm's export to the U.S. to construct the firm level tariff exposure. Is that correct?
Right, correct.
Why don't you use the overall export to the world as the base?
Oh, I think the other firms is not exporting to the U.S. or importing from the U.S. They are in the regression, so they are kind of act as control variables. I think, but we can do that. We can use like using the other country, but this shock is especially the U.S. is targeting like China, so that tariff has increased. So that's why we focus on the U.S.
Right. I'm thinking about this from the firm side. For example, if a firm exports, say, 50% of their revenue to U.S.
Oh,
right,
actually, actually we do that.
It's large.
Right. We also control for like the firm's U.S. export divided by U.S. sales as a robustness check and a later analysis. Not in this presentation, but we consider that part.
If there's time, I also have a question. So you have two measures separately for U.S. tariff and Chinese tariffs,
right?
But you know the Chinese side tariff change follows right after U.S. tariff. So is there really necessary to construct two variables, or
I think each firm, let's say like firm I or J, I can export and not import, and firm J can import and not export from to US. So there's a totally different like two measures. Even though in the aggregate level, the US tariff and then the Chinese tariff, but at the firm level, this is totally different. And we use that heterogeneity.
Yeah, but if you want to study the effect on firm level uncertainty, it's just one event, right? So
No. I think even though it's a one event, so this is heterogeneous across firms.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to need to move on to the next paper to stay on track. So thanks again, Jerem. The next one up is Lingsheng Meng on heterogeneous inputs of the Section 301 tariffs.
Right. Thanks for having me. And so this is joint work with Hongma from Tsinghua. So Trump promised to shake things up on the international trading order, and he's done so by enacting several waves of tariffs, increases on specific products, sectors, and countries. Although the tariff actions involved many countries, the primary target is China. So far, the US has imposed punitive tariffs on approximately 400 billion US dollars of imports. But you can see from this figure that 90% of these tariffed products are on Chinese goods. At the same time, the average tariff rate on Chinese goods has risen to 16.6%, which is in sharp contrast to the 2.3% running rate on products from other countries. So the new duties on Chinese imports, which is also known as the Section 301 tariffs, were rolled out in waves between 2018 and 2019. So the phased rollout of the Section 301 tariffs reflects changing policy priorities of the United States as the trade war between the US and China escalated. So if you look at the first and second tranches, the USTR targeted a narrow range of industrial inputs and equipment that may have contributed or benefited from China's industrial policies, including the so-called Made in China 2025. And the set of goods that may not, the set of tariffs that may not disrupt the U.S. economy, and tariffs that may have minimal impacts on U.S. consumers. So, in summary, the goods that are targeted in the first and second tranche of tariffs were deliberately selected. The third tranche of tariffs was actually a countermeasure to China's retaliation tariffs, which includes a much broader set of intermediate goods and many other consumer goods. It's worth mentioning that in the first and second tranche of tariffs, they do not target a lot of consumer goods. So the research questions for this paper are the following. First one is that how did the Trump tariffs affect U.S. imports from China? We're going to look at the value, the trade flow, and also the price, which is approximated by the unit value. And the second question is, are there any trade diversion effects from the bilateral tariffs? We're going to distinguish between two types of diversions. The first, the import diversions of U.S., which means that is U.S. able to purchase from other sources? And the second type of diversion is the export diversion, which means that is China able to sell more to countries other than U.S. because of its tariffs? So as a preview of our findings, we find moderate negative effects on the total value of imports from China. Tariffs reduces the trade flow. And in terms of prices, we find a complete pass-through of tariffs for the first two tranches. And in contrast, we find very limited pass-through of the third tranche of tariffs, especially for the consumer goods on the third list. We estimate large price reduction for homogeneous goods, goods with higher distribution margin, and goods with lower concentration, sectoral concentration, or goods that faces more competition from third countries. And in terms of trade diversion, we estimate asymmetric trade diversion after the Section 301 tariffs. We find very limited import diversion for US, which means that the US was unable to purchase more from other countries after the tariffs. At the same time, we find a significant export diversion from China, which means that China was able to sell more of the tariffed goods to countries other than the US. So there are growing literature on estimating the effects of the recent U.S. protectionist measures. I'm going to skip that. So what are the contributions, potential contribution of this paper? We provide new evidence on the dynamic effects of U.S. tariffs on Chinese products with a novel identification strategy. And we are able to provide new evidence on heterogeneity in the effects of the different rounds of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. And we also show new evidence on the heterogeneity in tariff pass-throughs. So for some of the goods, we found incomplete pass-through, and for other goods, we have we also estimate complete pass-through of the tariffs onto the consumers. And finally, we are able to provide some new evidence on the trade diversion effects of this bilateral tariffs. So the data we're going to use is kind of quite standard from the U.S. Census Bureau, monthly data at the most disaggregated level, 10-digit product category between 2013 and 2019. We are able to observe total value under quantity, so we can construct a proxy for the pre-tariff price, which is the unit value. So in terms of the research design, we are very careful about how to pick the control group, which is the products that were initially included, but eventually removed from the provisional tariff lists. For example, the first tranche of tariffs, initially there were over 800 dutiable product categories on the list, but after some time, more than 500 categories were dropped from the list. So we argue that these dropped items were quite similar from those that remain on the list. And we're going to show that for our identification, those dropped items indeed had very similar pre-trends, which is pretty useful for our identification. And we do so for the third list. And for the one thing I want to mention for the second tranche is that only 5 products were dropped from the list. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to use these 5 items as the counterfactual. Instead, we use the 500 also products dropped from the first list as the counterfactual, and we argue that these items are also very similar because first 2 lists mostly target the industrial inputs and equipment from China, and they're carefully selected based on the kind of the same criteria. And we're also very careful about how to select how to specify the event time. And for the Section 301 tariff, there is always a significant time gap between announcement of the tariff and also the implementation of these actions. So we expect that the forward-looking people, the U.S. importers, could act in anticipation of the future in treatment, which is normally known as the front-loading effect of pre-announced tariffs. So ignoring these effects could bias our estimate, and it could also be the front-loading behavior. If there's significant front-loading, it could be mistakenly interpreted as the evidence of differential pretrends, which actually do not exist in our framework. So what we do here is to define an interim period in between the announcement and implementation. We allow the time trends of the treaty and control to diverge during this period for reasons like front loading. So the summary statistics, one thing I want to point out is that we have 3 lists of goods. So so for the first 2 lists, as I mentioned, they were deliberately selected industrial inputs, intermediate goods, and equipment. So there's not a lot of consumer goods on those 2 lists. But for list 3, 20% are consumer goods. So in terms of the econometric specification, we first have this event study framework. So quite standard. We have the outcome is either the total value or the new value of imports from China. So the treatment is defined at the 8-digit level, which is the level at which the tariffs are imposed, which is also the level at which we cluster our standard errors. So we have dummies for event time, which is at the monthly level, and we also control for time dummies and product level fixed effects. So so this is kind of our first event study picture. The picture shows the dynamic monthly responses to higher tariffs. The dependent variable is the log value, the total value of imports from China. The horizontal axis denotes the months relative to the announcement of new tariffs. So the dashed vertical line marks the announcement, and the solid vertical line marks the months in which the new tariffs are also already in place. So to test for pre-existing trends, we include 12 months of leading trends in the regressions. As you can see, there's not much pre-trends here. But after the estimate turned negative after the implementation and stabilizes after 5 months. So this is the results for the log unit value, which is the price. We do not see much effects here, which indicates that the very limited the full pass-through of the tariffs. So for the second tranche, they're very similar, and which is more interesting is for the third tranche, the estimated effects start to increase after the implementation of the new tariffs. This pattern is consistent with the combined effect of the new tariff, which was 10%, and the threat of even higher tariff, which was 25%. The front-loading effect not only offsets but also dominates the discouraging effect of effective higher tariffs. And starting from the 4th month, however, the effect becomes negative and remain relatively stable for the next 4 months. This pattern stressed a declining front-loading effect, which is the 4th month in event time correspond to December 2018, which when the President Trump and President Xi announced a deal to suspend the escalation of tariffs. So as the trade tension eased, the importers seems to have formed a new belief that the punitive tariff of the third tranche will stay at 10%. Later, the U.S. raised the tariff rate to 25%. However, for the increase in tariff rates didn't seem to lead to any further decline in import value. And this picture shows that after the implementation of the tariffs, there seems to be some reduction in the price, which indicates some incomplete pass-through of the tariffs. So some static DD, which is kind of an aggregate effects of these tariffs. So negative effects on total value for all three tranches. For the first two tranches, very limited of the estimate, in any case, full pass-through of the tariff to the buyers. But for the third tranche, very limited, incomplete pass-through. So perhaps we don't have time for that. So the total impact is around $12 billion worth of U.S. imports from China, based on our estimates. So that, in terms of trade diversion, we kind of use data from U.S. imports from places other than China and China's export to places other than China. And so to summarize, there is no overall diversion of U.S. imports to third countries following the tariffs. So in results not shown here, we find some evidence of import diversion for homogeneous goods, but not for differentiated goods. So we estimate no diversion effects of U.S. imports to North America, Europe, and Japan. However, further analysis reveals the diversion of certain products from a few Asian economies, including South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So we also find significant export diversion for China following the U.S. tariffs, and these effects are heterogeneous across destination countries and across product lists. So to conclude, the U.S. tariffs reduced the trade flow from China, that is for sure, but were U.S. tariffs fully passed through to the Americans for the first and two tranches? Yes, and they are mostly intermediate goods and equipment. And for the third tranche of tariffs, no, the U.S. tariffs are not fully passed through to the Americans. And this result is mostly driven by the reduced price of consumer goods contained in this list. And the trade flows were diverted to third-party countries, especially for Chinese exporters. They were able to sell more of their tariff products to countries other than the U.S. And for the caveats, we're unable to capture the effects of trade policy uncertainty and disruption of the entire global value chains. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ling-Sheng. Comments and questions? Okay, well, I guess we're ready for the last paper then, which is to be presented by Yuan Mei, the impact of NAFTA on prices and competition, evidence from Mexican manufacturing plants.
All right, thank you very much for having me. So I'm Yuan Mei from Singapore Management University. This is joint work with Ken Kihawa from UBC Southern and Pablo Robles from the Brattle Group. So the research question we try to answer in this paper is, how do firms respond to trade liberalizations? Existing literature mostly focus on two channels. Firstly, firms serving domestic markets face more competition pressure due to low tariffs during trade liberalizations. And secondly, lower tariffs on intermediate inputs would directly lower the cost of production for those firms. In the seminal paper, econometric paper by DeLocker and co-authors, they actually document an increase of markups in Indian firms during the country's unilateral trade liberalization in the 1990s. However, a large fraction of tariff reductions actually occurred through mutual reductions. For example, if you think about a free trade agreement, both countries will lower tariffs imposed on each other. So in episode of such mutual tariff reductions, firms may also, especially the exporters, may also change their export prices and markups due to greater foreign market access. So hence, in order to investigate the firm's responses to such mutual trade liberalizations, we need to incorporate all these channels and conduct a comprehensive empirical investigation on whether such liberalizations are pro or anti-competitive. So the focus of this paper is the effect of mutual tariff reductions that occurred through NAFTA on Mexican firms. So we first decompose Mexican producer prices, which are observable, into unobserved marginal costs, MC, and markups, mu. To do so, we rely on a confidential product level data set that contains quantity and price data separately for exported and domestically sold products. We then use this a product level data set to estimate markups at plant product market level, following the approach popularized by the DeLocker and co-authors. So with the estimated markups and observed prices, we can then back out unobserved marginal cost. Next, with prices, back out marginal costs and markups for both domestic and exported products, we can then analyze their responses to reduction of tariffs through NAFTA in 3 channels: the competition channel, the cost channel, and the market access channel. Firstly, for the competition channel, Mexican firms now face more competition due to lower Mexican output tariffs. Hence, they are forced to reduce their axing efficiency and become more productive. Secondly, lower input tariffs would directly reduce the cost of production for Mexican firms, which will benefit them. And lastly, for the market access channel, since NAFTA is a mutual trade liberalization, lower US tariffs would grant more market access to Mexican firms, which could prompt them to change prices and markups. For all 3 channels, we exploit variations within plant product market level. And in the paper, we consider both average effect of tariff reductions and the dynamic effects over time. Although due to time constraint, in this presentation, I'll only talk about the average effects of tariff reductions. So here are the main findings. For the competition channel, we find that a reduction of Mexican output tariffs actually reduce both the marginal cost and prices of domestic products by Mexican firms, but the change in markups are insignificant. Once we control for the indirect effect through marginal costs, we actually find evidence of pro-competitive effect of the reduction of Mexican output tariffs. For the cost channel, we find that a reduction of intermediate input tariffs does not have any significant effect on Mexican domestic products. This is expected because only a small portion of Mexican plants actually import intermediate inputs. For Mexican exporters, we find that a reduction in intermediate input tariffs actually reduces their marginal costs, increases the markups, and the overall effect on prices is 0. Lastly, for the market access channel, we find that reduction of US tariffs on Mexican outputs or Mexican exports reduce the marginal cost of these exports, increase the markups, and overall effect on prices is a slight increase in prices. In this case, once we control for the indirect effects through marginal costs, we actually document an anti-competitive effect of reduction in US tariffs. This is a novel contribution as we are not aware of any existing literature that documents an anti-competitive effect in episode of mutual trade liberalizations. All right, so I won't have time to talk about literature, so I'll go straight to data. So here, basically, we have data for over 80% of manufacturing plants in Mexico. We observe quantity and sales values for both domestic products and those exported products. So the quantity and sales are at plant product market level. So this is very important. We're able to distinguish between domestic products and exported products. And we have plant level data on investment, capital, labor, and material inputs. Okay. So our first step is to use this very disaggregated Mexican data set to decompose observable prices into unobserved marginal costs and markups. Here, MC is marginal cost, mu is markups. To do so, we rely on a structural model of production. Basically, we estimate a quantity production functions at plant product market level. So with the estimated production function parameters, we'll then derive the estimates of markups from the firm's cost minimization problem. Now, once we have the estimated markups, prices are observable, we can then back out a marginal cost at plant product market level. All right, so here, I won't have time to talk in details about the structural framework. Basically, we follow the approach in the DeLogger paper and estimate a translog production function, assuming that firms minimize short-run cost of production and material inputs are freely adjustable. Then we can use the first order conditions of the firm's cost minimization problem to express markups as the product of the output elasticity of materials and the inverse of the expenditure share of materials in product market sales. Of course, estimating the parameters of the translog production function comes with several challenges. Here we have three main challenges. The first big challenge is that we don't observe input allocations at product level. Our input information, labor, capital, and materials is only at plant level. So basically, we cannot use multi-product plants for product function estimations. Our solution is to use single product plants to estimate beta, the parameters of the production function. Of course, this will introduce a selection bias. We control this bias by two approaches. One is we use the unbalanced panel of plants that may be single product at any point of time, but may become multi-product plants in other years. And secondly, we also use the Heckman selection correction to deal with the selection bias. The second challenge is that we actually do not observe plant product level input prices. Instead, what we observe is industrial sector level price indices. Here, our solution is to proxy input prices, use a function of output prices and market shares. The intuition for our solution is twofold. Firstly, conditional on price, products with higher market shares have higher quality. This is the product quality interpretation from Kendall. And secondly, high quality products use high quality inputs, which have higher prices. With this twofold intuition, we can use data on output prices and market shares to basically proxy quality and then proxy for unobserved input prices. And lastly, the third challenge we have is unobserved product quality, which leads to a simultaneity bias in production function estimation. Here, there's nothing new. We just follow the proxy method popularized by Ole Pickus and the Levinson pattern. All right. So basically, with all three challenges dealt with, we are able to estimate betas, the parameters of the translog production function for all single product plants. But for multi-product plants, we still need to find a way to recover the input allocation. Here, we need two more assumptions. Firstly, productivity is varies at plant level, and secondly, we have to assume that the expenditure share is common across input within the products. All right. With these additional assumptions, we're able to back out input allocation for multi-product plants, and then we're able to back out marginal costs and markups for all the manufacturing plants in our sample. All right. So here is our regression equation. The left-hand side is either price markups or marginal costs of a product market I of plant J in sector S at time T. All right, the right-hand side, we have three measures of tariff changes, which corresponds to three different channels. We also control for the plant product market fixed effect and sector year fixed effects. All right, so before I go to the results, so let me first talk about our identification assumption. So basically, our identification requires that tariff cuts during NAFTA to be exogenous at the plant product market level. So of course, you might have concerns regarding the endogeneity of such tariff cut schedules, but we have evidence. Our evidence makes us believe that that's not likely to be a problem. Firstly, it has been documented that pre-NAFTA tariff levels are actually uncorrelated with the phase-out period of NAFTA. And secondly, there's plenty anecdotal evidence that the Mexican negotiators actually had very little bargaining power during the negotiation, and a large number of clauses of NAFTA actually copied directly from the previous US-Canada free trade agreements. This would alleviate our concern that the tariff cuts might be endogenous to the US side. So here, here are the regression results for domestic products. So because of time constraint, I'll only focus on output tariffs, the competition channel, and input tariffs, the cost channel. So firstly, for the competition channel, here the results shows that 1% decline of Mexican output tariffs reduce marginal costs of domestic products by 0.15%. Also reduce the price of domestic products by 0.13%, but the overall effect on markup is insignificant. So this can be rationalized by the idea that once Mexican side lowers tariff, domestic firms in Mexico face more competition, and they are forced to reduce X inefficiency and increase their productivities. So we actually find that 1% point decline in Mexican output tariffs actually leads to a 1.3% increase in TFPQ, which is consistent with existing literature on trade liberalizations. For the input tariffs, we actually find that for domestic products, a reduction of input tariffs has no significant effect on prices, marginal costs, and markups. This is also expected because only a very small fraction of domestic producers in Mexico actually import intermediate inputs. All right, so let's turn to exported products. Here I'll just show the results, talk about the results of the third channel, the market access channel. We actually find that a 1 percentage point decrease of US tariffs actually led to a 1.34% decrease in marginal costs of exported products. But there's a 1.84% increase in markups, and the overall effect on price is 0.5% increase. All right. So again, here the rationale for reduction of marginal cost of exports is similar. So basically now with greater market access to the US market, Mexican firms are incentivized to upgrade their technology and become more productive so that they can export to the US market. We also actually find evidence of economies of scale. And for the increase in markups, that is just because of incomplete pass-through and also better market access. All right. So even with the increase in markups, the overall effect on price is an increase, but the magnitude of increase is still not large enough to have a increase of post-tariff prices faced by US consumers. All right. So in the next few minutes, I'll talk about the pro and anti-competitive effects of the output channel and the market access channel. All right. So in order to evaluate whether such tariff reductions are pro or anti-competitive, we cannot only look at the direct effect of tariff changes on markups. We also need to control for the indirect effect through changes of marginal costs. All right, so we cannot use the previous regression equation to estimate the pro or anti-competitive effects. Here, we use this regression equation. Basically, we add a control of basically a third order polynomial of marginal costs to control for the changes in marginal costs. We also instrument to deal with the attenuation bias due to the measurement error of marginal costs. And here for domestic products, the reduction of output tariffs actually reduce the markups, which means there is a pro-competitive effect of the competition channel. But for the exported products, we have a negative coefficient, which is evidence for anti-competitive effects of reductions of US tariffs. So to conclude, in this paper, we analyze the effect of tariff reductions through NAFTA on Mexican plants prices and markups, and we're able to distinguish between domestic products and exported products for all three channels: the competition channel, cost channel, and market access channel. And the main takeaway is that it's important to distinguish between exported products and domestic products because these exported goods behave differently from domestic goods. I'm right on time, and that's it. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Juan. Comments and questions? We still have a few minutes. Okay, well, thanks to all the presenters for really interesting presentations and for their punctuality. And I think we're done. So we'll move on to the next session.